Hello everyone. I'm going to tell you about tea tonight. We're going to make some, and I will also take the opportunity to explain all of these terms and types of teas that are sometimes mixed up. There is often a lot of confusion between the processing of tea leaves, which can give green, white, or black tea, and there are more of them that we will go through to compare their characteristics. And this gets mixed up with the regions of origin, like Darjeeling or Ceylon, and the blends, which are different teas put together, or the flavorings, like Earl Grey or Mint tea. So we will try to understand all of these things, and I will also tell you a little about the properties of tea, its history, how to prepare it depending on what you expect from it, and also these famous tea ceremonies from China or Japan. So let's get started. I have plenty of different tea boxes on my table tonight, and we're going to make white tea, which happens to be my favorite. I think the interest in tea has increased a lot in America and Europe since the 1990s, and there is a lot more variety available than before. But still, if you go to a supermarket and you buy tea, especially tea prepared in little paper tea bags, what you buy is by far the most common kind of tea outside Asia. You're buying black tea. So what is black tea as opposed to white, green, yellow, or even red tea? It's all about the processing of the leaves. Tea leaves come from a small evergreen tree or shrub, and the parts of the plant used to make the beverage are the leaves and the buds. It shouldn't be confused with the tree that serves to make an essential oil called tea tree oil. It can be confusing because this type of essential oil is often commercialized, playing on the name ambiguity and claiming properties comparable to a green tea, for example, when in fact it has nothing to see. It comes from another tree native to Australia. So the tea plant gives leaves of an intense green that can be processed to give beverages with a very different taste and intensity. So what does this processing mean? First, there is the harvest. Leaves and buds are plucked, generally twice a year, in spring and summer. The traditional way of plucking is by hand. It can be mechanized, but machines will break more leaves and include little twigs, which affects the quality. This is why high quality tea is always picked by hand, and this is the first element that affects the cost. As soon as they are separated from the tree, a transformation begins because the leaves will start to wilt. You know that plants, including fruits and vegetables, tend to turn brown when they are cut. This affects the taste and the color of plenty of food. And this browning happens because there are enzymes inside that react with oxygen and create pigments. Sometimes this oxidation is a problem, like when you cut an apple or an avocado, and they quickly turn brown. But it can also be used to our advantage. This process develops color and flavor in other types of food, like dried fruits or coffee beans, cocoa beans, and tea leaves too. So the leaves are left withering for a bit of time to let a bit of oxidation take place and also remove some of the water they contain. But it has to be made cautiously in a dry or breezy environment so that they don't start rotting. After withering, the third step is called disruption of the leaves. The leaves will be bruised by shaking them, and this is intended to quicken oxidation. Oxidation is maybe the most important step in giving a particular tea its color and flavor. The oxidation process makes tannins be released or transformed from the chlorophyll in the leaves. Choosing at which temperature to let the oxidation happen or when to stop it will affect the final product. And this is where the main differences appear between green, white or black tea. The shorter and less complete the oxidation, the lighter the tea should taste in the end. Green or white teas are lightly oxidated. Black tea is oxidated for a much longer time and it gets its strong flavor from it. Then when this oxidation phase has lasted enough, it is stopped by heating the leaves to stop the process and fix the color and taste at the desired level. After this, leaves are packaged and dried for conservation and transport. It can be made just by exposing them to the sun and air, or by panning or baking them. And once again, this new step, the packing and drying, will modify the final product. The least processed type of tea is green tea. There is almost no wilting, bruising or oxidation. Shortly after plucking, the leaves are steamed, rolled and dried. And the green color stays with the leaves and then in the beverage, because this tea was not given the time for oxidation to make it turn darker. Green tea is generally more expensive and presented as more exclusive in Western countries, but in fact it is in a sense the fastest to produce and the most consumed type of tea in countries like China, Japan and Korea. So there is a huge production, but it doesn't mean it is standardized. Depending on where it comes from and how it is dried, the taste and color can vary a lot. The most sought after green teas are made in Japan. The dried leaves are generally a bit darker and they have a characteristic seaweed smell after they have been brewed. And the beverage has a strong grassy taste. Now, one of the main elements behind the expansion of green tea in America and Europe has been the supposed health benefits. Honestly, these health benefits remain a bit controversial because an entire industry claims that green tea helps reduce cardiovascular and cancer risks or can help weight loss. but no clinical study has ever been able to prove it. And ironically, in countries that have consumed green tea for centuries, like China or Japan, it is not particularly associated with the same healthy image. It is just the go-to drink that people are used to consume. At least it is not harmful, and it is an efficient stimulant because it contains caffeine, like all teas. Another lightly processed type of tea is white tea. There is no general agreement on what white tea is exactly, but it is always a lightly processed type of tea. Like green tea, it is barely oxidized, but it is wilted a little bit before drying, and instead of being rolled in compact rolls before drying, like other types of tea, the leaves and buds are left looser. Often white tea is also made with younger leaves and buds that are not fully opened. The logic of the process is to obtain a lighter and more subtle kind of flavor. White tea is harvested and produced mainly in China, in the Fujian province. It is probably a relatively recent creation, maybe about 2 centuries, because there was no trace or mention of it earlier, contrary to other types of teas. After brewing, white tea is yellow pale, and personally I find it really pleasant. I don't drink that much tea, at least not every day, but when I do, I appreciate that it doesn't taste like grass, like green tea, and I find it more interesting than black tea that we will talk about in a moment. So keeping on with the different kinds of teas, from least to most processed, after green and white tea is a relatively rare and expensive type of preparation called yellow tea. The basis for the preparation is similar to green tea, except that a step of slow oxidation at a very precise temperature is added. I told you earlier that oxidation was stopped by heating the leaves. But if the temperature is maintained in a very narrow range, oxidation can continue at a slower pace. And this removes the characteristic grassy smell and taste from green tea and gives it a more mellow flavor. Yellow tea is more complex to produce, but like white tea, it has a very subtle and somewhat complex flavor that is quite different from the taste we generally associate with tea in Western countries. Our next sort of tea, still based on processing, is Oolong tea. Oolong is a traditional process that includes more oxidation, but Oolong teas can range from light to heavy oxidation and have very different processings. These are the main fine teas produced in China, and they have a long tradition. Most Oolong teas are made with a single cultivar of the tea plant and in a particular region, which guarantees the stability of the final product. Oxidation can range from only 8%, which is light and just a bit more than white and yellow teas, or be much stronger, up to 85%, with such different ways of processing the leaves, the flavor can vary widely. Some are fruity and sweet, whereas others that have been oxidated more intensely can develop woody and roasted aromas. The word oolong is actually an English term that has passed to other languages, but in China these teas are called Qing cha, dark green teas. And if you want to try elaborate, authentically Chinese sorts of tea, this is where you should look. What all oolong teas have in common is also the very strict attention to timing and temperature in every step of the leaves preparation. Oolong tea comes from mainly two regions in China, Fujian, which has the most expensive and exclusive oolong teas, and Guangdong. There is also an important production in Taiwan, and there are oolong teas made outside China too. The production method has been copied in India. There is Darjeeling oolong or Assam oolong, and even in Vietnam. As we keep moving with the sorts of teas, if oxidation is complete, you get black tea, which, as I said at the beginning, represents the bulk of tea consumption outside Asia. If you buy tea, especially in tea bags at a supermarket, or if you ask for tea somewhere without precising anything, this is what you get. Chinese people call this tea red tea, and it is not particularly popular in China or Japan. This sort of very oxidized tea was developed actually from the 18th century because it suited European traders, the British in particular. The oxidation and drying of black tea makes it able to retain its flavor for a very long time, several years. As long as it is kept in a dry place, it won't change. As opposed to lightly processed teas, green tea, for example, has a relatively short duration. It loses its flavor in 12 to 18 months approximately, so it needs to be brewed relatively shortly after processing. Black tea was ideal for international trade when it took months to return to Europe from China, and it was developed especially under the impulse of British merchants. They needed a cargo to return to Europe, and they popularized tea consumption first in Britain, and later it also took off in other countries as a way to sell at a good price this new exotic beverage. As other countries that adopted tea before, the British added their own cultural touch to it. So typically it became popular in the 19th century to drink it with sugar. When you think about it, something that seems as simple as a cup of tea with sugar required transportation between continents on huge distances, and it was a global drink. Tea came from China, sugar from America, the Caribbean, and these ingredients were gathered and consumed in Europe. Now, the purists can be slightly demeaning to black tea because it is not typically Chinese nor Japanese. It is more often than not processed industrially, especially from Indian plantations that were created by the British in the 19th century. And it is also the cheapest. But there are very different qualities of black teas too. They are generally strong because the full oxidation has released a lot of tannins, but it doesn't mean they all taste the same. The most refined ones are generally sold with the whole leaf. There is an intermediate quality with broken leaves, and these two are generally sold loose by the weight. Then there are the ready-to-brew tea bags, which remain the easiest and most frequent way of consuming tea in the West. The content of the bags is broken leaves and dust that are leftovers from the production of more expensive varieties, or sometimes they can be grinded to fill the bags. That's why the purists will not go for bagged tea. Their content is the bottom of the barrel, and on top of that, the bag itself may alter the taste because it is made of paper. You often get strong tea by using tea bags because the smaller the fragments of tea leaves in contact with water, the faster they brew and transmit their flavor to it. When the content of the bag is just dust, it's going to diffuse really quickly into the water. Black tea is produced massively for local consumption and exports in India, in Sri Lanka, Ceylon, in China, but in the case of China it's essentially for export, and in some African countries. Kenya is a big producer too. We are not entirely done with the types of processing, because there is a highly sought after and precious kind of tea called fermented tea. These teas have undergone a period of fermentation that can last from several months to several years sometimes, and this completely alters the color and taste. They are referred to as dark teas in China, not to be confused with black tea. The Chinese don't care much for black tea. They call fermented teas dark teas just because the liquor they produce is darker. The most famous fermented tea is Pu-erh from the Yunnan province. And fermentation really changes everything, and one can barely recognize it is tea. The smell is different, the taste is more mellow, and they have a strong aftertaste that lasts much longer than any tea we discussed before. The fermentation also reduces or completely eliminates bitterness and astringency in tea, and the fermentation process is codified, and post-fermented tea usually gets more valuable with age. It starts with green or Oolong tea that has partially oxidized, and then begins the fermentation process with molds and the aging process. It is a bit like wine. When appropriately processed, the aging makes fermented tea gets better and better. Pu-erh tea, for example, can be aged up to 50 years without diminishing its quality once the fermentation has been stopped and the leaves have been dried. So So we have reviewed the kinds of teas you may encounter. But together with the type of processing, another difference between teas is the region they come from. There are plenty of regions producing tea in the world. The two biggest producing countries are China and India. Actually, the cultivation of tea in India on a large scale is relatively recent. It was inherited from the colonial period. But like many countries that adopted tea, Indians have turned it into a national beverage, and they have developed their own ways of drinking it. Depending on the region, it can be prepared with milk, with honey, or flavored with spices. The Middle East and North Africa have also adopted tea. They are not big producers of the plant, except Turkey, but tea is also generally flavored and sweetened with a lot of sugar. My absolute favorite among flavored teas is mint tea, that is very popular in North Africa, especially in Morocco. Mint leaves are infused in the preparation. It is sweet and served hot, but the menthol inside makes it also very refreshing at the same time. In Europe too, tea has been adopted and turned into a national drink in Britain. It didn't start before the 18th century, and initially it was a luxury item for the high society or special occasions. But it became much more popular in the 19th century when tea from India arrived in much larger quantities. The price fell regularly all along the 19th century until it became an everyday drink in every social class. The traditional British preparation is black tea with milk and sugar. But the British have also developed different flavorings and blends, such as Earl Grey or English breakfast. So what are these? Earl Grey is not a particular kind of tea, it is a flavoring. And oil of bergamot is added to black tea. Bergamot is a small citrus fruit that grows in the south of Italy. It is not eaten much because it is very bitter, but it is used a lot as an ingredient in perfume making, and it gives Earl Grey tea a citric flavor. Nowadays you can also find green tea or Oolong tea flavored Earl Grey style. It is no longer only black tea. English breakfast tea is a blend, because most of the time black tea sold in the West is not from a single place or type of tea plant. The leaves are blended to maintain consistency in flavor or because it is more advantageous in terms of cost. The composition of English breakfast tea may vary from one brand to another, but they all include black teas from Assam in India, Ceylon, and Kenya too. So now that we have seen how it is manufactured, let's talk about how a tea should be prepared and the various rituals called tea ceremony. It's really not complicated to pour hot water on a tea bowl or a tea bag. But a slightly uncomfortable thing is that you never know exactly what temperature is optimal and how long you should wait before drinking. And the answer is, it all depends on the type of tea you are preparing and the result you want to get in terms of taste and stimulating properties from caffeine. Also, for many people, part of the joy of tea is in the ritual to prepare it. So let's see how to do it properly if you wish to elevate the experience. And I will also tell you a little about these tea ceremonies in China and Japan. So first you need to heat water, preferably not tap water. It can be perfectly safe, especially after heating, but it often has a taste due to additives, and you will find this taste in your cup when it's ready. So filtered or spring water, but without too many minerals, are better. Then there is the temperature. For teas that are stronger, like black tea or most Oolong teas, water needs to be almost boiling, around 90-95 degrees Celsius. But you should not heat water that much for less processed varieties like green or white tea, because their flavor is more delicate and it could be made more bitter if water is too hot. But obviously all these are not rules anyone is forced to follow. If we do it for enjoyment, it is like for wine. The only valid rule is however you like it. But if you wish to experiment or make the experience more complex, you need to know that black teas need hotter water, close to boiling, to develop all their flavors. And lighter teas, like green tea, will be less bitter and better express subtle flavors after the initial dominant one when you swallow them, if they are prepared in water around 80 to 85 degrees Celsius, around 180 Fahrenheit. This is when boiling has not started yet, but the water is beginning to simmer. Oolong tea is in between black and green in terms of temperature, but they can be very different depending on their processing. So you need to check with the seller or look at the container for information. The hottest water you need is for fermented teas like Pu-erh. It is better to use frankly boiling water to release their aromas, and many people prefer to rinse the leaves with boiling water before brewing, because there can be a bit of tea dust that results from the aging process, and the rinsing removes this dust. Now what most people would do would be to pour the water and wait a bit before serving. But often in Asia, and especially with Oolong teas, the first brew is just thrown away because it is considered a rinse of leaves rather than the final brew that should be drunk. Green and white tea can be brewed once or twice because they quickly release the flavors and there is not much left afterwards. Stronger teas can be brewed multiple times, ideally with slightly hotter water each time. And many Oolong teas are said to improve after the first few brews. What quantity of dry tea should be used? A rule of thumb is 1 teaspoon or coffee spoon for every cup of water. Once again, it's up to you and it depends on what kind of intensity you want to achieve. But a more economic way to increase the flavor is to just wait more time during brewing instead of wasting more leaves. A common recommendation for the preparation of black tea is to wait about 4 minutes, but it can be anywhere between 30 seconds and 5 minutes. The less you wait, the less intense the flavor will be, but your tea is also going to be more charged in caffeine, because caffeine is among the first elements to be released in hot water. Then tannins start to be released too as you wait, and they increase the taste, but they also neutralize caffeine. So if you're looking for a beverage that gives you a stronger kick, go for a short brewing, closer to 30 seconds or 1 minute. If you want a more intense flavor or a beverage that is less stimulating, wait more, up to 5 minutes. The same applies to the release of caffeine in coffee, by the way. Now tea tends to be less charged in caffeine than coffee. A cup of tea has about 50% to 80% as much caffeine as a cup of coffee. But it depends so much on how it is prepared that sometimes tea will have a stronger stimulating effect than coffee. The traditional way of preparing tea is in a teapot in most countries, but if it is just for 1 cup, it is perfectly fine to do it directly in the cup. An advantage of the teapot is that it can be heated before to preserve the beverage's heat. This is what is done in the traditional Southern Chinese and Taiwanese ceremony. We'll talk about that in a minute. Another thing that can be tried is a cold brew. Hot water accelerates brewing, and it is also safer because it kills bacteria. In many parts of the world, that is an important point. But wherever you live, you need to be cautious if you brew with cold water, because bacteria on the tea leaves or in the water may multiply even if you keep it refrigerated. Cold brew requires more time, about 50% more time. That's not a huge difference, and it will produce a different taste profile because some of the tannins will not be released, or very few of them. It can be less bitter, for example. It also tends to lower caffeine, which is extracted much faster in hot water. So now that we have waited enough, how should tea be poured? Because this is not irrelevant. In various places in Asia and in North Africa, tea is poured from height. This may alter the flavor a bit through aeration of the tea, and it also helps cool the beverage so that it can be consumed immediately. Now in Asian countries that have a long history of tea drinking, like China, Korea, Japan or Vietnam and India, there are ritualized forms of making tea called tea ceremonies that have appeared along the centuries. Sometimes they date from medieval times, sometimes they are much more recent, and they are also very different in process and importance from one country or one region to another. The matrix of these rituals, like for many things cultural in Asia, is China. Some tea ceremonies rituals can be serious and performed during religious ceremonies, but they can also just be a way to socialize and be much less serious and solemn. What they have in common is a sense of refinement in simplicity and a focus on the beautiful and the repetition of the same gestures. In a sense, tea ceremonies are not limited to Asia. There tends to be rituals and a tea culture around the sharing of the drink. Everywhere it has become a part of local culture. And their implications go way further than the drink itself. And that's the case even outside Asia. For example, in Britain, in the 19th century, during the Victorian era, appeared the afternoon tea type of social event that could be compared to these rituals. Tea was a pretext for a social event in which people who participated were expected to display the right manners and their connections to their social circle, and for the host, display the right equipment in teapots and cups. The country that has the most varied tea culture is probably China, because of its size and different regions and the very long history of tea drinking. Casual tea consumption on a daily basis is common pretty much everywhere in China, but there are times when it takes a more social dimension. For example, offering tea is a way to show respect or to apologize. Younger people are supposed to offer tea to members of the older generation. In the past, it also worked between social classes. People from a lower class would offer tea to people in a higher position. It can also be an apology and a sign of regret. Children who have misbehaved can offer tea to their parents as a way to close the argument and accept that they were wrong. In a traditional marriage ceremony, the bride and groom serve tea to their families as a way to show gratitude and celebrate the joining together of the two families. This kind of occasion is more solemn and serious, but one of the forms of Chinese tea ceremony that can be performed anywhere is the Gongfu Tea Ceremony. The Gongfu Tea Ceremony appeared as a way to prepare and present tea in a way that enhances the taste and in an environment that generally doesn't need to be that ceremonious. People will talk to each other all along the ceremony, and there is no huge symbolic or religious meaning attached to it. It is as much a method to prepare tea as it is a ceremony in the sense we use the term in the West. If you participate in a Chinese tea ceremony anywhere in the world, especially in a shop selling Chinese tea, chances are this is what you're going to attend. A master of ceremony prepares tea and serves it in front of you, paying particular attention to the temperature first. It is going to be boiling water for fermented tea, a bit less for Oolong tea, depending on the type, and the temperature of water needs to be maintained constant. The utensils needed to perform the Gongfu ceremony are a kettle. Traditionally, it stays on a coal or a gas stove to maintain the temperature constant. Then there is a tray with two levels. The upper one is made of wood or metal with openings so that the water can fall to the lower level of the tray. The most important element is the teapot. Traditionally, it is made of clay. clay tends to absorb some of the tea's flavor, and bit by bit, every time it is used, each teapot acquires its specificity depending on what has been done inside. But to avoid unfortunate blends between different teas, each teapot will be used only with one sort of Oolong tea. So the preparation begins by pouring just hot water in the teapot, and this hot water is emptied in two types of cups. There are drinking cups and smelling cups that will serve to enjoy the smell. And on the preparation tray too. The reason for this is to heat all of the accessories so that they help preserve the tea's heat later. Then 2 spoons of tea are put into the teapot, which is now empty. When the leaves are in, the teapot is filled with water again, and the water immediately pours over the accessories a second time. This heats them more and also rinses the tea leaves inside the teapot. The teapot has a small enough hole to keep the leaves inside each time it's emptied. Then comes the time to brew, finally. The teapot is filled again for the 3rd time, and with more water than it can contain. This will make the water spill out and eliminate the foam that may have appeared. After a short wait, when tea is ready, it doesn't go straight into the cups. It is transferred to a jug, which is another accessory required to perform the ceremony. And this stops brewing because the leaves stay in the teapot, so all the content of the jug will remain stable in intensity and flavor. Tea is still not transferred to the drinking cups immediately. First it goes into the smelling cups I mentioned before. The master of ceremony invites people to smell the smelling cups and appreciate the flavor. Then tea goes from the smelling cup to the drinking cup. It is counterintuitive, but the smelling cup develops more aromas when it is emptied because of the aeration of the few drops that stay inside. So before drinking their tea, the guests are invited to smell the smelling cups again, and they have more smell than when they were full. All along, temperature is kept stable between the various containers thanks to the splashing with hot water at the beginning. So despite being transferred several times, tea remains hot when it reaches the drinking cups. Brewing is generally much shorter than we used to. It can last only 20 to 30 seconds for stronger varieties. But the leaves can be reused multiple times, up to 10 times, and they will be left steeped for longer in each new teapot. So as I told you, this type of Chinese ceremony is a method to get the best of tea and develop a visually pleasing ritual around it. A type of tea ceremony that is more charged with symbolism and a form of spirituality almost is the traditional Japanese ceremony. It is called chadō, and it involves the ceremonial preparation and presentation of matcha, which is green tea in powder. The development of this ceremony was influenced by Zen Buddhism, and there are various rituals depending on different schools and the degree of formality of the ceremony. But in general, it is a precisely choreographed ritual, and its reason to be is not just to appreciate a drink, it is also to please guests and connect with them in an experience. It is meant to create a special and precious moment. So the aesthetical aspect is very important in this Japanese ceremony, because preparing tea with elegance and attention to every single detail is a sign of respect and appreciation to the guests. As I said, the tea used in this ceremony is almost always matcha, a sort of tea that is very pricey if you buy the impeccable ceremonial quality. Matcha is a powder made with green tea leaves, and it is the strongest kind of green tea because you ingest the entire leaf mixed with water when you drink it. Tea is served to a small group of attendees by a host, a master of ceremony, always experimented, who performs a series of very codified moves with various items. There are many of them, but the essentials are a rectangular white piece of fabric. There is also a square of silk used to symbolically clean every object and manipulate the kettle. There's also a bamboo dipper to transfer water, and there is a tea bowl. The bowl is the most important object. Some of them can be several hundred years old, and they keep being used even if they have imperfections. There is an aesthetic concept and spiritual disposition in Japan called wabi-sabi, and this is the name given to the fact of appreciating or finding beauty in things that are simple, modest, and at the same time imperfect or damaged by the passing of time, because through this imperfection they express the work of time and men. Wabi-sabi is an inspiration in the creation of dry gardens with stones or in the work on bonsai. It invites to find out and feel the beauty of things that are imperfect and ephemeral, even the most modest things. Ancient bowls may be repaired and their imperfections surrounded with gold to showcase them. These accidents and the fact that they keep being repaired and used make them even more interesting and precious. Among the utensils, there is also a tea box that can be of wood or ceramic, and also a whip used to mix tea and water. All these objects, there are many more, are cleaned and stored very carefully between two ceremonies, and some of them can only be manipulated with gloves. The host can be male or female and usually wears a kimono. The guests also have to dress up formally. When the ceremony takes place at a tea house, the guests wait a moment in a garden until the host calls them. Before joining him or her, they clean their hands and rinse their mouth in a small stone bowl, and they are invited to admire scrolls in the room where the ceremony is going to take place before sitting on the tatami. It is still too early for tea. In this room, the guests are served a light meal followed by sake. If there is no meal, in case it is a simpler ceremony, the host will serve immediately confections to them. Then every item that will be used is cleaned symbolically in front of the guests, symbolically because they are already perfectly clean before, in a precise order and with very precise gestures. Absolutely nothing is improvised, everything is codified. Each object is placed in an order determined by the preparation that will follow. When the host is done with this preparation, they place a quantity of matcha in the tea bowl and the appropriate quantity of water before mixing. In more formal and longer ceremonies that include the light meal, followed by another wait in the garden and then confections, two different teas are served. First, there is a thick tea with more matcha powder, and later a thin one with less powder. In less formal ceremonies, there is no meal. After their initial wait, the guests are offered confections directly, and the preparation of tea follows. The guests share the thick tea bowl, one after the other, and they exchange salutations between them, even though they have been together for some time already. Thin tea, which is lighter, is served in individual bowls. Once all guests have finished their tea, the host cleans every utensil in front of them, and the guest of honor asks the authorization for the guests to examine them. These utensils are then passed to each guest by their neighbor and visibly admired by them. No matter what they think, they are showing respect and gratitude to the host. The whole ceremony lasts from 1 to 5 hours, depending on its degree of formality. Guests know before they arrive. The type of invitation tells them what they should expect. During the entire ceremony, so that can be several hours, conversation is kept to a minimum. There is no small talk between the guests or with the host. It is all about being in the moment, appreciating the beauty of each thing, from the garden to the entire set of objects involved, in a ceremonial that will be without any surprise, and this keeps the guests in a peaceful state of mind. Everyone plays their role, host and guests, and contribute to create this precious and unique moment. I hope you enjoyed this introduction to the world of tea, and that it gives you the curiosity to try more varieties and learn more about tea culture in general. Thank you very much for joining me tonight, and I'll speak to you soon about another topic. Au revoir.